All right, so let's dive into this thing with the Biden administration, right?
They're
Right.
right.
They just dropped some new rules about exporting AI chips and models, and it's a pretty big deal in the tech world.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even just about the chips themselves. It's really about who gets to be like at the forefront of AI development globally. Who calls the shots.
Yeah, it's like setting the stage right for who dominates AI in the future.
Hmm.
And I've been going through all these articles you sent, New York Times, Wired, Reuters, and they all seem to say the same thing. The U.S. is drawing some pretty clear lines in the sand here.
Right.
It seems like they want to make sure that they and their allies are the ones calling the shots in this whole AI game,
Yeah.
not their rivals.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's pretty fascinating, right? Like they've basically carved up the whole world into three tiers. Like when it comes to who can access American AI tech.
Three tiers. Okay, so break it down for me. How does this three-tier system work?
Well, think of it like this. You've got the US and all their close allies, right? Like the UK, Canada, Japan, all the major European countries. Those guys, they get to go wild. They have unrestricted access to AI tech. That's tier one.
Unlimited sprinkles on their AI Sunday.
Got it. So what about all the other countries? What do they fit in?
Well, you've got about 120 other countries, think like Switzerland, Israel, places like that. They're in tier two. They can still get the good stuff, but there are quotas on how much they can actually buy.
Okay, so limited edition AI flavors for them. I get it. Makes sense. So that's two tiers. What about that third tier you mentioned? Who falls into that category?
Tier three. Those are the nations that, well, the U.S. has arms embargoes against them. So think China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. They're basically locked out. No AI party for them.
Wow. That's a pretty bold move. It really makes you wonder why now? Why is the Biden administration pushing this so hard? Is it all about national security or is there something else going on here? Well, national security is definitely a big part of it. I mean, they're worried about adversaries using AI to, like ramp up their militaries or cook up bioweapons, even run simulations for like nuclear stuff. Not exactly the kind of scenarios you want to see playing out.
No, not at all. Definitely can see why that would be a top concern. But you mentioned something else is going on here, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it's also about economic power, right? I mean, AI is the next big thing, and the U.S. wants to make sure they and their allies are the ones reaping those economic rewards that come with leading that charge. All those jobs, all the innovation, they want it to happen on their turf.
Right. Yeah. It's like they're saying, we're investing a ton in AI, and we want to make sure we're the ones getting the returns on that investment.
Exactly. Exactly. And remember that quote from Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor? He said, the U.S. wants to keep the infrastructure for training those super advanced AI models, keep that all within their borders or with their closest partners. They don't want that capacity offshored, as he put it.
So they're drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is where the future of AI is being built,
Mhm.
here or with our friends. And I'm guessing the main player they have in mind here is.
China, no doubt about it. China has been pretty vocal about wanting to be the global leader in AI, and these new rules, they're clearly designed to throw a wrench in their plans.
It's not like this is totally out of the blue, though, right? The U.S. has already had some restrictions on sending those really advanced AI chips over to China,
Right. But this takes things a step further. They're trying to cut off any backdoor routes that China might try to use to get their hands on this tech.
like sneaking it in through other countries or something,
Exactly. Or even, setting up shop in other countries and building those powerful AI models there. The U.S. is trying to shut down all those loopholes.
like building a wall around China, at least when it comes to this advanced AI tech. But what makes them think they can actually pull this off?
Well, you know what happened with Huawei last year, right? They discovered that Huawei, which is a Chinese company already under sanctions, was getting AI chip components from a firm in Taiwan, which, is a direct violation of those U.S. export controls.
Kind of playing with fire, you might say. So I can see why the U.S. is like clamping down even harder now. They're sending a message. But I'm guessing not everyone is exactly thrilled about this, right?
No, definitely not. You've got some major players in the tech industry pushing back and pushing back hard, especially companies like NVIDIA.
NVIDIA. But aren't they like the biggest name in AI chips right now? Why would they be against this?
Well, they, along with groups like the Semiconductor Industry Association, are saying that cutting off access to a market as big as China, that's going to stifle innovation.
So they're saying limiting their sales to China is actually going to hurt their ability to invest in the next big breakthroughs.
That's their argument. They say it just reduces the incentive for American companies to, put resources into that cutting-edge research and development. Plus, they're worried that it could actually end up benefiting those foreign competitors, maybe even Chinese companies in the long run.
Okay, I see. How would that happen?
Well, their point is, if global buyers can't get what they need from those U.S. companies, they'll start looking elsewhere.
Hmm.
And then that just creates an opening for companies in other countries to step in and, well, take the lead.
That's a valid point. I bet NVIDIA isn't shy about making their concerns known.
Oh, not at all. They came out swinging, called the rule unprecedented and misguided. You can really feel the frustration there.
So you've got the U.S. government pushing for these controls, these tech giants like NVIDIA pushing back, and then China caught right in the middle of it all. But let's get down to the nuts and bolts here. What specific technology are they targeting with these rules? What's the big deal?
Well, one of the key things is this: high bandwidth memory, HBM for short.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. I've heard people talking about HBM, but for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar, break it down. What is it, and why is it so important?
HBM, it's basically a type of computer memory, and it's absolutely crucial for developing and training those super powerful AI models we were talking about, right? It all comes down to memory bandwidth, basically, how fast data can move between the memory and the processor.
So the faster that data can flow, the faster the AI can learn and work, right? Like having a superhighway for information.
Exactly. And these new rules, they specifically restrict exporting that advanced HBM to China and to any company anywhere in the world that's owned by a Chinese company.
Oh, wow. So they're not just trying to stop China from buying this tech, they're trying to stop them from building it too. Who are they targeting with this specifically?
Well, they're going after companies like Huawei, which design some pretty advanced AI chips, and CIMIC, which is China's main chip manufacturer.
So they're going right for the heart of China's ability to build the foundations for a really powerful AI infrastructure. But hold on a sec. Didn't you say earlier that NVIDIA is actually against these restrictions? Wouldn't limiting HBM hurt them too?
Well, it's a bit of a double-edged sword for NVIDIA, right? I mean, they oppose the export controls in principle because they argue it harms the industry as a whole. But in the short term, they might actually end up benefiting from these specific HBM rules.
How so?
Well, you see, these new HBM rules, combined with that recent order for TSMC, that's the Taiwanese chip giant, to stop sending AI chips to China.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about that.
Right. Well, those two things together, they could end up hurting NVIDIA's Chinese competitors more than NVIDIA itself, at least, for a while.
So they're in this weird spot where they don't like the overall approach, but they might actually come out ahead because of it.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. But on the other hand, you've got the Chinese government launching that anti-monopoly investigation into NVIDIA. And that could really throw a wrench into things. China's not messing around. They're making it clear they are not happy about these restrictions.
Things are definitely heating up. So we've got NVIDIA stuck between a rock and a hard place. But beyond just the impact on specific companies like NVIDIA, are there any broader concerns about how these new rules are going to work in practice?
Oh, absolutely. People are worried about loopholes, and whether the U.S. can even enforce these rules effectively. For example, there's this 120-day consultation period before the rules even kick in.
Meaning?
It means Chinese companies have a window of opportunity. They can stockpile chips and equipment before the door slams shut.
Yeah, I bet there's a mad dash right now to get their hands on as much as they can.
You can bet on it. And then there's the whole issue of how the U.S. will actually enforce these rules, right? They rely really heavily on what are called advisory opinion letters from the Bureau of Industry and Security.
Advisory opinion letters. What are those exactly?
Think of them like secret passes that let companies buy AI chips. But the catch is, nobody really knows the rules for getting those passes except the U.S. government.
So there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of potential for things to just slip through the cracks.
Exactly. And that's the concern. How can you make sure these controls are being applied fairly and effectively when so much is riding on these behind-the-scenes decisions? It's something we'll have to watch really closely as this whole thing plays out. It feels like we're at this, turning point, like a big one, for the whole AI landscape. And remember, these rules were announced right as the Biden administration was on its way out.
Right, exactly. So the big question now is, will the new Trump administration stick with this whole approach? I mean, they're going to be the ones actually enforcing these rules, right?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've seen so many policy shifts back and forth between the two administrations. It's tough to predict what's going to happen, but here's what we do know. Both administrations, they've both said they're deeply concerned about China's ambitions in the tech world.
So even if they might go about it differently, that underlying goal keeping China's tech aspirations in check, that seems to be something they both agree on.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Whether these specific export controls are the way to achieve that goal, that remains to be seen. But what is clear is that the AI landscape is changing fast. And these controls, they're a major development that could have, really lasting repercussions.
No doubt. We've been talking about the impact on companies like NVIDIA and all the political maneuvering between the U.S. and China. But what about the bigger picture here? Could there be, like, unintended consequences to all of this?
Oh, absolutely. Anytime you have a policy this sweeping, there are going to be ripple effects. Think of it like throwing a giant rock into a pond. You get that initial splash, but then you've got these waves that spread out and they impact the whole ecosystem.
So what kind of ripples are we talking about here? What should people be paying attention to?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is that these export controls could actually backfire, and they could end up hindering global collaboration in AI research and development.
So by trying to restrict access to this technology, the U.S. could accidentally push other countries to just develop their own separate AI ecosystems. So instead of everyone working together, everyone just goes their own way.
Precisely. If you're a brilliant AI researcher in a country that now has limited access to those American chips and models, you might just decide, okay, I'm going to focus on developing my own solutions, even if they're not as advanced, at least not at first.
It's like that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention, right?
Right.
You create a roadblock, people find new paths.
That's the irony here. By trying to contain China, the U.S. might actually be speeding up the development of new alternative AI hubs in other parts of the world.
So instead of having this unified global AI scene, you could end up with a bunch of different countries or regions, each with their own standards and approaches. What would that mean for the development of AI as a whole?
Well, it could have a few implications. For one, it could slow down the overall pace of AI development. Collaboration, that free flow of ideas, it's crucial for scientific progress. If researchers and companies are working in isolation, it's just going to take longer to make those big breakthroughs.
It's like everyone's working on a piece of the puzzle, but nobody can see the whole picture. Makes it a lot harder to put everything together.
Exactly. And beyond just the pace of development, this fragmentation could lead to compatibility issues. Imagine a world where different countries are using AI systems that can't talk to each other, can't share data easily.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster, especially when you think about things like global trade or healthcare or even security. Instead of this global AI ecosystem that benefits everyone, you just end up with this patchwork of incompatible systems.
And that's where things could get really dangerous. If these export controls backfire and lead to a more fractured AI world, it could actually make the U.S. less safe in the long run.
It's almost like they're trying to win the battle but losing the war.
That's a good way to put it. The U.S. might be able to control access to those most advanced chips in the short term, but what happens if it just leads to the rise of new independent AI powers that they have less influence over?
And that brings up another point. Is it even ethical for one country to have so much control over a technology that has the potential to impact the entire world? Maybe we need some kind of international framework, for governing AI development and making sure it's used for good.
Those are some really crucial questions we need to be asking ourselves as a global community. And we might not have all the answers right now, but it's a conversation that needs to happen sooner rather than later, before things get even more complicated.
We've been focusing a lot on the U.S. and China, but what about the rest of the world? How might these export controls impact developing countries?
That's a great question. AI has the potential to really transform societies all over the world, especially when it comes to tackling challenges in healthcare, education, agriculture, even things like poverty.
But if these countries are cut off from those most advanced AI tools and expertise, won't that just widen the gap between the haves and have-nots?
It's a real concern, yeah. And it's not just about access to the technology itself. It's about having the resources, the infrastructure to develop and deploy AI solutions that are tailored to their specific needs and challenges.
So even if they could get those latest chips, they might not have the capacity to actually use them effectively.
It's a multifaceted challenge, and it's one that the international community needs to address if we want to ensure that AI benefits everyone, not just a select few. Now, we've talked a lot about the potential downsides of these export controls, but it's important to acknowledge there could be some upsides too.
Interesting. So you're saying there's a chance that these restrictions could actually be a good thing for AI development, In the long run, how so?
Well, one argument is that by limiting access to those advanced AI chips, the U.S. is essentially forcing everyone to become more efficient with how they use computing power.
It's like saying, look, we're not going to give you an endless supply of resources, so you need to figure out how to make the most of what you have.
Exactly. And that could lead to some really interesting innovations in areas like AI model optimization or the development of more energy efficient hardware.
So instead of just throwing more and more processing power at a problem, researchers and companies will have to get more creative about how to achieve those same results with less.
Right. And this could actually speed up the development of AI solutions that are more sustainable and less reliant on those massive data centers that just gobble up so much energy.
So it's like a constraint that actually leads to a more innovative and efficient approach to AI development. Are there any other potential upsides we should be thinking about?
Well, another possibility is that these restrictions could actually force companies to focus more on developing those specialized AI chips that are designed for specific tasks or industries.
Instead of trying to build like this one-size-fits-all AI chip, they can focus on building chips that are optimized for, say, healthcare or manufacturing,
Precisely. And that could lead to a more diverse AI hardware landscape with different companies specializing in different niches.
which could ultimately lead to a more, well, robust and resilient AI ecosystem.
It's certainly a possibility, and it's one worth exploring further. These export controls are clearly meant to hinder China's AI ambitions, but they could also have some unintended positive consequences for the broader AI landscape.
It's still early, but it's going to be fascinating to see how all these dynamics play out over the next few years. What are your thoughts on whether the Trump administration is likely to keep these rules in place?
Well, during his previous term, Trump took a very hard line on trade with China, imposed tariffs and other restrictions, and he's been pretty vocal about his skepticism of free trade agreements.
So you're thinking his past actions might indicate he's inclined to keep these export controls in place?
It's possible that America First approach that he'd championed during his presidency, it suggests that he might be sympathetic to this idea of, protecting American dominance in key industries like AI.
But on the other hand, he's also a businessman. And businesses generally don't love government interference in their operations.
True, and the tech industry has been very vocal, about their opposition to these controls. So there's going to be a lot of pressure from some powerful companies like NVIDIA to roll them back.
Sounds like it could really go either way.
It's a real toss-up right now. It's going to depend on a lot of factors. Who ends up in his administration, the advice he gets from his advisors, even just the overall political climate at the time. But one thing's for sure, this is a decision that will have huge implications for the future of AI.
Absolutely. We'll be watching closely to see what happens. This has been a whirlwind tour of these AI chip export rules and all their potential impacts. But for now, let's take a quick break.
All right, so we're back, ready to, wrap up our deep dive into these AI chip export rules. It's been quite a journey, huh? We've gone from the really specific details of these restrictions to the potential impact on those big companies like NVIDIA, and now we're talking about like the future of AI on a global scale.
It really does show you how AI isn't just a tech issue anymore, it's geopolitical. And this move, no kidding.
Yeah.
They're definitely not backing down from this fight. These export control, it's a bold move, a real power play in the AI world. It almost feels like we're watching the opening moves in some high-stakes chess game with everyone trying to, outmaneuver each other.
And that's what makes it so interesting, right? We've talked about how this will impact companies and governments, but what about all those unintended consequences? What if, by trying to contain China, the U.S. actually ends up creating like a more fragmented, less stable AI world?
Yeah, we talked about that a bit earlier. It's like they're trying to build a wall around China, but it might just end up pushing other countries to develop their own AI ecosystems.
Yeah.
Completely outside U.S. influence.
That's the big question, isn't it? Could these restrictions actually backfire? Could they lead to a world where the U.S. is no longer the undisputed leader in AI? A world where the power is more spread out and, innovation happens in all these unexpected places?
That would be a pretty big shift. I mean, we're so used to thinking of Silicon Valley as the center of the tech universe. But what if the future of AI is being written somewhere else?
It's a possibility worth considering, and it leads to maybe the most important question of all. What does this all mean for, you, the listener? How might these export controls impact your life, your work, even the future of the world you live in?
That's a million-dollar question. And unfortunately, we don't have that crystal ball. But I think this deep dive has given us some important things to think about as we, try to navigate this crazy, rapidly changing AI world.
For sure. I think the first thing is to stay informed. Keep an eye on how these export controls are actually being implemented, how other countries are reacting, and what new developments are popping up. Knowledge is power, especially in this age of AI.
Absolutely. And as AI becomes more powerful, we need to keep asking those tough questions, the ethical questions.
Mm.
How do we ensure that AI is actually used for good? What safeguards do we need to put in place so we can, avoid those unintended consequences?
They're not easy questions, but we can't afford to ignore them. And maybe even more importantly, don't be afraid to challenge the assumptions that are shaping this whole AI landscape. This field is still evolving, and there's no guarantee that the current balance of power will stay the same. Be open to new ideas, new perspectives, even new ways of thinking about the role of AI in our lives.
We've covered a lot of ground today, and it's clear that these AI chip export rules, well, they're a major turning point. They have the potential to reshape the entire AI landscape. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last thought to kind of chew on. What if, in trying to contain China, these export controls actually end up accelerating the development of, like, a more decentralized and democratized AI ecosystem?
A world where power is more evenly distributed, where innovation flourishes in, unexpected corners of the globe.
It's definitely a thought-provoking idea, and it's one that we'll be watching very closely in the months and years to come.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.